Okay, I hope you enjoyed that video, one of my favorites. Let's keep going with the lecture now, talking a little bit more about rational choice theory. Now, in the rational choice theory model, I told you that Cornish and Clarke, the creators of the theory, think that this theory can explain two different processes: crime involvement and crime-specific decisions. Let's look more closely at this first process, which they call the crime involvement process. Cornish and Clarke really see the long-term decision to enter into a life of crime as a gradual, again, long-term process. Much like the process of learning, training, and entering into any kind of profession, entering into a long-term life of crime follows a similar process. For them, this process involves four main areas. The first are background factors that might play a role in making someone enter into a life of crime. For example, coming from a broken home, or coming from a very disadvantaged neighborhood, having parents who might have themselves committed crime in their lives, having below average intelligence. All of these examples for Cornish and Clarke are the kind of background factors which might make you more likely to enter into a life of crime. The second area that they thought was important was prior learning experience. What that means is whether or not a person has either direct or observational experience with crime. For example, if you are becoming a burglar, like our liquor store burglar, if your parent was a burglar and you've had friends over time that have burglarized things, over time you might not see burglary as being something that's so wrong if it gets you the things that you need. So prior learning experience, which might encourage criminal activity, could be an important part of the long-term process into becoming a criminal. The third area that they thought was important were the idea of needs. Things like money, sex, peer acceptance, excitement, needing status amongst your friends. All of those are things that people might believe, validly or not, that they are things that they need. Again, going back to our liquor store burglar friend, it might be the case that someone might become bored with things like school and regular jobs and craving the thrill of committing crime, such as committing burglary. You might think of needing to brag about things to your friends, needing social acceptance. Whatever the reason, their point was, if the things that you feel that you need in your life propel you toward criminal behavior, you're going to get more and more involved in a long-term life of crime. And the fourth area that they thought was important was the idea of a person's ability to evaluate solutions to problems. In other words, when a person encounters a problem or some kind of obstacle to getting what they want, they think about a lot of different things before they decide to enter into a life of crime. For example, the amount of effort needed. It obviously takes a lot more effort and a lot more time to get money by working at a job than it does by robbing a store. The reward expected is another thing that someone might evaluate. The certainty and severity of punishment is another example. So going back to our liquor store burglar friend, it makes sense that he thought that it seemed like the quickest and easiest way to get what he wanted by taking it, by burglarizing a store. If you think that you're highly likely to get away with something, that also might increase your chances of getting involved in a life of crime. So again, if you think back to our liquor store burglar friend, it might be possible, by looking at all of these different areas of his life, to explain why, over a gradual, long-term period of time, he entered into a life of crime. To model this theory out a little bit, which I always think helps make people understand the processes at work in a theory, think about the theory and the crime involvement portion of the theory from this perspective. The first things that go into the crime involvement model are some of these background factors: previous learning experiences and needs. If you think about our burglar friend, think about some of the different background factors and learning experiences and needs that he felt were necessary in his life that might have propelled him toward evaluating his potential solutions and coming up with the decision not to solve those solutions by legitimate work, but going into a more illegitimate criminal lifestyle. For example, somebody who grows up in a poor neighborhood with poor role models and needs that he feels are necessary in his life might evaluate that solution by working hard or getting into gambling or playing the lottery to get ahead. All of those are legitimate for the most part solutions to the problems that you face given your background. But what Cornish and Clark wanted to emphasize in their theory was people who make the decision based on all of their background factors to get into an illegitimate lifestyle do so because all of those prior things put them at a higher risk to do so. And again, this is the criminal involvement model, meaning that for Cornish and Clark, this overall process that you see before you, can explain the overall long-term decision to enter into a life of crime. And if you think about it, it can also explain the overall decision in a person's life to not enter into a life of crime. Okay, the second part of the rational choice theory model, if you remember back, is that Cornish and Clark believed that rational choice theory can also explain crime-specific processes. So what they mean by that is they're trying to bring back this idea of rational decision-making to explaining individual crime-specific decisions. For example, think back to the burglar in the liquor store video and think about some specific decisions that he had to make. The point that Cornish and Clark want you to see is that the crime-specific process really occurs after somebody has gone through the more gradual process of deciding to engage in crime. And the crime-specific process is relevant to explaining specific decisions about criminal incidents. What they wanted to make clear in their theory was that a lot of different situational factors might be able to impact and change these decisions. Think back to our burglar example. What are some things that he had to decide before actually committing this crime? Well, first of all, he had to select an area. And for the most part, Cornish and Clark make the point that when selecting an area to commit crime, people tend to make decisions based on things that are familiar to them, things that they know they could get easy access to, places with low security and not a lot of police patrol. All of those individual situational factors impact a person's decision on whether or not to start to burglarize. He also had to commit and make the specific decision to select the particular store that he decided to burglarize. You can think of a lot of different situational factors that might have impacted this. Was it empty? Is it a detached building, or is it attached to other stores around it? Is there a watchdog? Is there an alarm system in place? My point in telling you all of this is that according to Cornish and Clark, whether or not you want to explain why someone enters into a life of crime, or you want to explain a specific incident, what you should be interested in is the decision-making processes that went on. Ideally, if we can understand the decision-making process that goes into committing different types of crime, the hope is that we can alter the situational context and factors and then prevent crime by trying to change people's decision-making. In other words, making targets less appealing, making it more difficult to break into a home, making alarm systems more visible. All of these things, by changing situational factors, might be able to alter a person's decision-making in their choice to enter into a life of crime and their choice to commit specific criminal acts. Now, you guys might feel like rational choice theory sounds an awful lot like deterrence theory, which we talked about last time. If you feel that way, that's good, because they share many common elements, and a lot of people consider rational choice theory as kind of the next era and next age of deterrence theory. So rational choice theory and deterrence theory share a lot of similarities. First of all, they're both interested in the choices people make to commit crime. They are both choice-based theories. They also both seek to understand how punishments can deter crime in the future. And not just punishments, but how different situational factors can influence and deter crime. But there are also some differences between the two. First of all, rational choice theory is much more interested in the impact of informal punishments. If you remember back to deterrence theory, a lot of the research that was done on it in the 1960s and the 1970s was evaluating things like the impact of incarceration, the impact of arrest. And in rational choice theory, the theorists in this era make the point that punishments can be inflicted by a lot of people other than the criminal justice system. For example, punishments can be inflicted by parents. Punishments can be inflicted by your friends. Shame and embarrassment can actually be thought of as a form of punishment if they deter and make someone less likely to commit crime. If you're afraid of being punished by your parents, or you're afraid of being embarrassed by your friends, all of those things can be factors that can influence your decision making. So in that way, rational choice theory moves our thinking to a much more individual level, informal process. Rational choice theory is also firmly planted in individual level understanding. What I mean by that is, when you're studying rational choice theory, you're no longer studying things like arrest rates and crime rates, but you're studying individual people's decisions for individual events, and understanding how people perceive and interpret the costs and benefits of actions. So it's work that's interested in the individual level perceptions that people have. And you could make the case that the research in rational choice theory and deterrence theory really complements both of them. So these three theories that make up the previous class and today's class often get lumped into one overall theoretical area. A lot of people consider rational choice theory, routine activities theory, which we'll talk about next, and deterrence theory as really one larger theoretical idea. And that's a good thing, because again, all of these theories are choice-based theories. Theories that are interested in and most concerned with what choices people make. So you should appreciate the fact that they are all considered in the same theoretical area, but you should also be aware of some of these minor differences between them, which give each of them their own research and their own merit. In this case, the differences between rational choice theory and deterrence theory, I think one of the biggest things that you should keep in mind is the idea that rational choice theory is bringing informal sanctioning experiences and individual level decision making into the debate. Now, like all of the theories in this class, not everyone likes rational choice theory, and not everyone agrees that rational choice theory is the best explanation for why people commit crime. Some of the biggest criticisms of rational choice theory come from research that people have done on people's impulsivity. Basically, the arguments that come from this camp question the fact that all decisions people make are really rational. For example, people who conduct research on impulsivity make the claim that a lot of criminals, when you ask them after the fact, do not report much planning that they went through in whether or not they were going to commit a crime. Similarly, a lot of people's research has shown that many people do not report that they considered really carefully any of the consequences of committing an act. So in that way, critics of rational choice theory really cast doubt on the idea that people's decisions when committing crime are in any way rational. Now, a rational choice theorist would counter this by saying that however little you actually plan or consider consequences, if you go through it even for a moment, if you do even a quick split-second decision making when you're going to commit a crime, you can consider that a rational process, again, in a bounded way. So rational choice theorists would counter the criticisms from impulsivity researchers by saying that just because someone makes a rushed or a quick decision doesn't mean it's not rational. The only thing that it has to be a rational decision is aligning with that person's preferences. Now, in the future, rational choice research will have to address how rational choice theory can be applied to crimes that don't seem to come from any kind of rational decision making. That will be an important hurdle for rational choice theorists to face in the coming years. Rational choice theory is one that has experienced a number of scientific tests throughout the years. Most people who test rational choice theory, at least in the past couple decades, have done so by using what we call scenario designs. What this means is that people who are testing this theory select random members of the general population and ask them to report on scenarios that they are presented with. In other words, they ask people to read scenarios where a decision might have to be made. And they ask participants in the studies, what would you do in this situation, in this scenario? And what would influence the decision that you've made? In this way, they're trying to get an assessment of a person's decision-making process. Now, the assumption here, of course, is that the assessment of a scenario and a person's projected actions, what they think they would do, are comparable to what they would actually do in real life. That's an assumption that you have to make doing this kind of a test. One example of a scenario design that has been used a lot to try to test rational choice theory is drunk driving studies. Now, in these studies, what researchers are trying to do is assess what people would do in different scenarios where they could or could not make the decision to drive home drunk, and what different kinds of things would influence that decision. In other words, what things might influence someone to feel that it was okay to drive home drunk, and what things might influence someone to say that they would not drive home drunk. So in these studies, they give people scenarios describing someone making the decision to drive home drunk or not, and they measure whether or not the people who are given the scenarios, not only if they say they would do that, drive home drunk, but what kind of things might influence that decision. Interestingly, what they found when doing these drunk driving studies is that people are a lot more worried about the public embarrassment and the shame that they might face if they were caught driving home drunk than they are about the actual legal consequences. In other words, people are much less worried about the actual problem of arrest and potential punishment from the criminal justice system, and they're much more worried about the punishment that they might face at home by being shamed and scorned by their family, friends, and loved ones. So this is an interesting study because these studies have shown that non-legal punishment, experiencing or feeling shame, is a really important deterrent in whether or not someone's going to commit this crime, driving home drunk. Another set of studies that have been done and found support for rational choice theory are sexual arousal studies. Now, in these experiments, which have actually been conducted for the most part at the University of Maryland, what they do is primarily this is done with male participants. They have some men in the study read or watch materials meant to heighten their arousal, often pornographic material, and others do not read or watch these materials. Then they have all of the men in the study read scenarios where a decision would have to be made whether or not to sexually assault or be sexually aggressive with a woman. Interestingly, what they found in this study, and what they found in several similar studies, is men who were put into a state of sexual arousal before reading that scenario report that much more likely that they would behave aggressively towards the woman in the scenario. In other words, men who were sexually aroused and then read a situation where they could or could not act in an aggressive manner are much more likely to say that they would act in the aggressive manner. The point here that researchers thought was interesting is that it might be the case that being put in different emotional states has an actual meaningful impact on decision making in scenarios. In other words, our rationality might be altered in states of arousal or other heightened emotional states. Generally, these studies, drunk driving studies and sexual arousal studies, all offer support for rational choice theory. They offer support because people who go through the studies report that different things influence their decision making, and their decision making alters based on situational factors. In other words, when given scenarios, people who think that the certainty or severity of expected punishments would be great are less likely to commit criminal acts. Whatever kinds of punishments that might take in terms of form, the point is, people do utilize their information about the certainty and severity of punishments when deciding whether or not to commit an act. But this research also suggests that our ability to utilize rational decision-making might change in different emotional states. In terms of where this theory is headed, the future of rational choice theory, there are a couple interesting areas of research that are currently being undertaken. The first area, which is a fairly new area of research, is the idea that there might be different levels of rationality between people. In other words, this research really questions the idea that everyone actually has an equal ability to make rational decisions. Maybe only some people are actually deterrable. Maybe only some people go through the rational choice decision-making process like we would expect. The person most responsible for going forward with this future area in rational choice theory is a criminologist named Eric Pogarski. And in a really influential paper that he wrote in 2002, he makes a pretty compelling argument against the idea that everyone has an equal ability to make rational decisions. Essentially what he does is he divides most people in the population up into three basic groups: acute conformists, deterrable offenders, and people that he calls incorrigibles. Now, acute conformists is a group that he thinks makes up probably a large portion of our society. These are people who, regardless of the situation, are probably never going to commit crime. People who conform and don't commit crime, not because they're deterred or impacted by the possibilities of punishment, but because they are more driven by some moral ground that committing crime is wrong. So for these people, they really don't go through that much of a rational decision-making process in whether or not to commit crime, because they're just very unlikely to commit crime anyway. The third group there, the incorrigibles, are just the opposite of acute conformists. And for him, these are people who, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the threat or possibility of punishment, are always going to commit crime if it gets them what they want. In this way, any way that you alter the situational factors or the certainty and severity of punishment aren't really going to impact these people because they don't pay attention to those things. They're more interested in getting what they want, however they want to get it. And finally, the group that he puts in the middle, deterrable offenders, make up people who might commit crime if they decide that it's going to get them what they want, but have the ability and are likely to be impacted by individual level factors. In other words, this is the group of people who, if you alter the situation, if you alter the certainty and severity of punishment, actually might use that information and have it change their rational decision-making process. The problem with this area is not a lot of people have an ability to really say for sure where we should put moral beliefs in this decision-making process. Pogarski seems to believe that acute conformists are much more driven by moral beliefs, but it's very difficult to actually test or measure or assess someone's moral beliefs. And one of the criticisms and problems with this area of rational choice theory is we don't have much of a really good ability to account for how much of what people do or do not do is driven by what we call morality. In a few other research papers, which we won't really go into detail here, in the 90s, researchers described how moral inhibitions make things like the level of sanction threat irrelevant for many people. But if someone's moral inhibitions are low, sanctions may play a larger role. So really, one of the challenges for this future area in rational choice theory is actually trying to account for and assess people's moral inhibitions and beliefs. Another future area of rational choice theory, which has garnered a lot of interest in the past couple of years, relates to research that's done on what we call the gambler's fallacy. Now, this is another new area, and it's especially interested in how people's perceptions of costs and potential negative aspects of committing a crime might change over the course of their offending life. The basic idea here is that after committing crime, people tend to reset their perceptions of the costs and benefits of committing that act. In other words, it's called the gambler's fallacy because people tend to associate things that are actually independent actions as having some kind of a relationship. Now, that might sound a little confusing, so let's talk about an example. And let's go back to the ideas of drunken driving. Let's say you go out on Saturday night and get really drunk and make the decision to drive home drunk. You drive home drunk, nothing happens to you, you pass out in bed, you wake up the next day. Now, for those of you who, not saying that any of you do, but for those people who don't get caught drunk driving, they might have an inflated perception of their ability to avoid detection. In other words, if you don't get caught a few times, your perception of the chances of being caught might get lower and lower, even though in actuality they're not. So, for people who don't get caught when they commit a crime like drunk driving, they might commit more crime over time because of some inflated sense of their ability to avoid detection. In other words, if you don't get caught more and more over time, you have an inflated perception of your ability to avoid detection, when in actuality you probably don't. Another interesting part of the gambler's fallacy is what goes through people's heads when they do get caught for committing a crime. For example, if you, same scenario, go out to the Thirsty Turtle and get very drunk and make the decision to drive home, but then get pulled over and given a breathalyzer test and get punished for, you get a DUI, you might assume in the future that statistically there's such a low likelihood of getting caught for the same crime twice that you're going to commit crime again. So in other words, some people who do get caught for committing a crime assume that the chances and the likelihood of getting caught again are so low that there's no reason to not commit the act. Now, this idea of the gambler's fallacy is an interesting idea in rational choice theory because what it's showing is that people's perceptions of the costs and benefits of committing crimes change and get altered and sometimes reset as they continue on with their offending. So just coming up with a person's one level of perceptions might not be accurate. It might be more interesting to follow a person's perceptions of the costs and benefits of committing crime over time to see how things like getting caught or not getting caught change and alter a person's perceptions of the likelihood of getting caught again. Much more needs to be done in both of these areas in terms of the future of rational choice theory, but they're examples of some of the interesting areas that people are working on right now in the theory.